The Book of Lamentations, attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, is a collection of 5 poetic laments mourning the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the resulting exile of its people. Written in the aftermath of this catastrophic event, the book expresses deep grief, anguish, and despair, yet it also offers glimpses of hope in God's enduring faithfulness. The poetry uses acrostic structures and vivid imagery to convey the depth of sorrow and theological reflection on suffering. In the first chapter, the poet mourns the desolation of Jerusalem, personifying the city as a grieving widow abandoned by her lovers, allies. Once full of people, the city is now empty, her children taken into exile. The chapter emphasizes the suffering brought about by Judah's sins, highlighting how God's judgment has fallen upon his unfaithful people. The poet laments the city's loss of glory and the betrayal of supposed allies who have turned against her in her time of need. Chapter 2 focuses on God's wrath and the destruction of Jerusalem as a manifestation of his judgment. The poet describes the complete devastation of the city, including the temple, which was the center of worship and a symbol of God's presence. The cries of starving children and the suffering of the people are vividly portrayed, showing the overwhelming impact of God's anger against their rebellion. The chapter calls attention to the role of false prophets who misled the people, contributing to their downfall. In the third chapter, the poet shifts to a deeply personal lament, describing his own experiences of suffering as reflective of the nation's agony. Despite the darkness, this chapter contains one of the most profound expressions of hope in the Bible, the assurance that God's mercies are new every morning and that his faithfulness endures. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 to 23. The poet encourages waiting on the Lord and trusting in his salvation, even in the midst of affliction. This balance of despair and hope reveals a deep understanding of God's justice and mercy. Chapter 4 contrasts the former glory of Jerusalem with its current degradation. The poet laments how the once esteemed leaders and wealthy citizens now suffer alongside the poor and destitute. The suffering of children, the famine, and the horrors of the siege are graphically described. The chapter attributes the downfall of Jerusalem to the sins of its leaders, particularly the priests and prophets, who failed in their duties to guide the people in righteousness. In the fifth and final chapter, the tone becomes a collective prayer for restoration. The poet speaks on behalf of the survivors, pleading with God to remember his people and restore them to their former relationship with him. The chapter acknowledges the ongoing suffering of the people, including oppression by foreign nations, famine, and shame. It ends with an unresolved tension, as the poet appeals to God for renewal while expressing uncertainty about whether he has completely rejected his people. Throughout the book, the poet grapples with the theological implications of Jerusalem's destruction. The suffering is portrayed as a direct result of Judah's sins and God's righteous judgment, yet there is also an acknowledgement of God's compassion and faithfulness. This tension reflects the complex relationship between human sin, divine justice, and the hope for redemption. The poetry of Lamentations serves not only as an expression of grief but also as a form of communal and individual repentance. It invites readers to reflect on the consequences of sin, the reality of suffering, and the importance of returning to God with humility and faith. The book's structured laments provide a framework for processing loss and seeking God in the midst of despair. Lamentations ultimately points to God's sovereignty and his capacity to restore what has been lost. While the book ends with a lingering sense of uncertainty, it also leaves open the possibility of renewal and redemption, foreshadowing the restoration of Jerusalem and the hope of God's covenant promises being fulfilled. The enduring themes of faith, repentance, and God's mercy resonate deeply with those experiencing suffering and seeking hope.